स्क्रीन गया. Yes. Good morning, one and all. It's nice to be back with you after a long time. Today we will be talking about two topics. One, the gastric secretions, and the other is the gastric motility. We know that once the food is chewed in the oral cavity and forms a bolus, after partial digestion of the food in the oral cavity, it enters into the esophagus, and through the esophagus it enters as a bolus into the stomach. We have got a lower esophageal sphincter, which is the junction between the esophagus and the stomach, which is normally closed. As this bolus enters into the esophagus, crosses the distal two-thirds of the esophagus, there is a relaxation of the sphincter, and this relaxation of the sphincter causes the bolus of the food to enter into the stomach. Once it is in the stomach, the digestive process begins with the secretions of the stomach, which are known as the gastric secretions. Today, let us go into detail about the various phases of the gastric secretions and the mechanisms how the gastric secretions are regulated when the food is in the stomach. Later, in the later last half of the class, we shall discuss about the motility of the stomach, that is, what are the factors which are causing the stomach to close, to contract, and what are the factors which inhibit the stomach contractions, that is the gastric contractions. So let's begin with the gastric secretions. Now, to start with a little basics. Let us briefly discuss about the stomach. The functions of the stomach. The stomach not only has a digestion function, but it also has some other important functions, a number of important functions. One, it acts as a short-term storage reservoir. Reservoir in the sense that the human physiological process is so destined that we eat 2 to 3 times in a day, we have 2 to 3 meals. So this meal, whenever we eat, is completed within a short span of, let's say, 10 minutes to 20 minutes, whether it's in the morning, breakfast, lunch or dinner. But these 15 minutes or 20 minutes, the quantity of intake which we eat should provide us energy so that the body can sustain with a normal carbohydrate, proteins and fat levels for, let's say, a duration of 6 to 8 hours. Therefore, it is important that this food which we eat gets churned up, gets broken down and gets digested, and once the digestion is completed, it absorbs into the blood and the nutrient so absorbed gets stored in the body. So for a brief period of time, the stomach acts as a reservoir where the food is stored for a couple of hours. The normal gastric emptying time is around 2 to 3 hours. So once we take in a food, the food remains in the stomach for 2 to 3 hours. In this 2 to 3 hours, the stomach sees to it that the food is broken down, it's churned, broken down into small bits so that it can get easily digested. And once it is digested, that is into more simpler compounds, it is absorbed from the stomach and enters into the circulation and is stored in the body as energy storage houses. The other function of the stomach is that it also has ability to secrete an intrinsic factor. This intrinsic factor is responsible for the absorption of vitamin B12 later in the body, and this vitamin B12 is important in maintaining a normal nerve function. The third function of the stomach is that it causes the chemical and the enzymatic digestion of the various foodstuffs, that is the carbohydrates, fats and proteins. Especially it is the proteins, where the complex proteins are broken down into simpler proteins and digestion is initiated. The other functions are the liquefaction of the food. That is, the whole solid food is broken down into small particles, and this small particles of the food or the bolus of the food is converted into a liquid which is known as chyme, so that this chyme can get easily digested and absorbed. And last but not the least, the function of the stomach is that it sees to it that once the food is broken down into a liquid chyme, it is slowly released into the small intestine, so that in the small intestine further processing is taken place. So that one of the function of the stomach lastly here is that it doesn't allows bulk flow of the chyme from the stomach into the intestine. Instead, it slowly releases over a period of minutes to hours, so that the small intestine has got sufficient time for the food, partially digested food, to be completely broken down into the small intestine and absorbed down further down in the intestine. Now let us see some of the gastric secretions. Now basically the secretions which are coming from the stomach are called as the gastric secretions. There are basically two types of glands in the stomach. One is the gastric glands and the other is the pyloric glands. The gastric glands are also called as oxyantic glands. They are mostly present in the fundus of the stomach or the body of the stomach, whereas the pyloric glands are highly concentrated in the pylorus of the stomach. Now, what does this gastric gland secrete? These gastric glands have certain different types of cells, and among them are the oxyantic cells, and these cells secrete different substances. One of them is the hydrochloric acid, and this hydrochloric acid is important in maintaining a acid pH of the stomach. It is because of the secretion of this hydrochloric acid and specifically the hydrogen ions, the pH of the stomach remains at 2, and when food in fact is in the stomach, the pH can become more acidic and in fact fall to around 0.8. Now, why do we need this acidic pH? The acidic pH is necessary because the other enzymes which are secreted by the other gastric glands, especially the pepsinogen, which is in an inactive form, has to get converted into an active form of pepsin, so that the pepsin can digest the proteins. Now, this conversion of pepsinogen to pepsin and for the action of pepsin requires an acidic medium. This cannot happen in an alkaline medium. Hence, there is a acidic pH has to be maintained when the food is present inside the stomach. The other substance which is secreted by the gastric gland is the intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor of Castle, it is secreted from the gastric glands, and there it binds to the vitamin D, it binds vitamin B12, and this binding of vitamin B12 by the intrinsic factor protects the vitamin B12 from being destroyed in the stomach due to the acid pH. Once this binding takes place of the vitamin B12 to the intrinsic factors and is protected from further breakdown, it is slowly pushed into the small intestine, and in the lower down in the intestine the vitamin B12 is absorbed. In addition to this, we have got mucus glands. The mucus glands have mucus cells. These mucus cells secrete mucin. This mucin plays a very important role in the stomach because this mucin or this mucus gland secretes a substance which is called as mucin. This mucin forms a protective covering along the stomach, along the walls of the stomach, and prevents the damage to the internal structures of the stomach wall. That is, it acts as a protective barrier and protects the gastric glands and the stomach wall from the acidic nature of the hydrochloric acid. So it is a protective in nature. Once in some cases where the mucin barrier is broken down, this hydrochloric acid percolates through this barrier, damaged barrier of the mucosa, and then it irritates the stomach wall, irritates the nerves there, stimulates the pain nerve fibers, and results in pain. It is this breaking down of this mucus barrier which is one of the pathophysiological basis in gastritis or in gastric ulcers. Hence, sometimes you may find that there is a burning sensation in the stomach after taking food, or pain in the stomach. The reason there being hydrochloric acid is being secreted, the hydrogen ions are being secreted whenever you take in food, and this increase in the hydrogen ions increases the acid, makes the stomach more acidic, and this acid hydrogen acidic HCl percolates or passes through the damaged mucosal barrier and irritates the stomach. In addition to this, we know that the pylori glands are there. The pylori glands also have mucus glands. These pylori glands, or the mucus which is present there, secretes mucin, and this mucin will also help in protecting the pyloric region of the stomach from the acidic hydrochloric acid. The other important structure which is present there is the gastrin, the secretion of the gastrin by the G cells. Now, gastrin is a hormone which is secreted by the G cells. The G cells liberate this gastrin hormone, and this gastrin hormone stimulates the release of hydrochloric acid. So, one of the factor which is causing a responsible for maintaining a acidic pH in the stomach is the release of the hormone gastrin. The hormone gastrin is released from the pyloric glands, from the G cells present in the pylorus. There it travels into the cardiac area and the fundus of the stomach, where it secretes the peptic cells, stimulates the peptic cells or the parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid. So in this way, one of the factors which stimulates the hydrochloric acid or stimulates the release of hydrogen ions is gastrin. Now, in the gastric glands, as we discussed earlier, there are three types of cells: the mucous neck cells, which secretes mucus or mucin. We have got the chief cells or the peptic cells. These peptic cells or the chief cells secrete two substances. One is pepsinogen and the renin, which helps in the digestion of the proteins. The other is the parietal cells. The parietal cells are responsible for the secretion of the intrinsic factor, which absorbs vitamin B12 and the hydrochloric acid, which maintains or is responsible for the maintenance of an acid pH in the stomach. So this is the small diagram. Maybe in histology, in anatomy, they will teach you about the structure and the lining or epithelial lining which is present there, and in detail about the histology of the parietal cells and the chief cells. Now, what is the function of the parietal cell? The parietal cell is basically a villus-like cell, and it secretes hydrochloric acid. What is the mechanism of hydrochloric acid secretion? Basically, the hydrogen ion concentration in the parietal cell secretion is comparatively much higher than what is present in the blood. One of the important structure which is causing the secretion of hydrogen ion into the lumen from the parietal cells is the hydrogen proton pump. Hydrogen potassium potassium pump. It is also known as the proton pump. Since this structure or this pump pushes out the hydrogen ions from the parietal cells into the lumen cells, it is called as a proton pump, and it is an active pump. It is basically by a primary active transport, it is by a secondary active transport, and the enzyme responsible there is hydrogen potassium ATPase. Now here you can see the diagram there, where you have got on one hand, this is the parietal cell, this is the lumen of the stomach. Here you have got the blood vessel, that is the vascular supply. Here you can see water is present there. The water is broken down into hydrogen ion and a hydroxyl ion. This hydroxyl ion combines with the carbon dioxide which is entering from the blood into the parietal cell. This carbon dioxide combines with the hydroxyl ions to form a bicarbonate ion, and this bicarbonate ion is pushed out from the parietal cell into the vascular system, into the blood. The next question is, what happens to the hydrogen ions? The hydrogen ion, which is formed in the parietal cell, is secreted into the lumen of the stomach, and this process is done by a pump which is known as a proton pump, and that proton pump is a hydrogen potassium pump. See that this is an active pump where one hydrogen ion goes out from the parietal cell into the lumen of the stomach, and then one potassium ion enters from the lumen into the parietal cell. So this is the hydrogen potassium pump, which is called as a proton pump. The active functioning of this pump is responsible for maintaining an acid pH in the stomach. This acid pH in the stomach, because of the hydrogen ions, is necessary for the digestion of the proteins, because it is in this acidic medium only that the pepsinogen can be converted into an active pepsin. It is exactly this pump also which is used in pharmacological. This hydrogen potassium pump is used as the pharmacological basis for treating many patients with gastric ulcers, hyperacidity, and related conditions. I'll briefly explain to you the clinical pathophysiology associated here. There is an increased hydrogen ion secretion. When this hydrogen ion secretion is in excess, or there is a breakdown in the mucosal barrier, this breakdown in the mucosal barrier will cause these hydrogen ions to enter into the stomach wall and will cause pain. It will start damaging the epithelial cells there, it will damage the smooth muscle, and because of this rent in the mucosal barrier, the acid causes pain. The patients will normally complain or will come to you with complaints that after eating food there is a burning sensation in the epigastrium, or there is pain in the epigastric region. The physiology, the pathophysiology is that this hydrogen ion secretions are in excess, or there is a hyperacidity happening, or there is a movement of these hydrogen ions through the barriers, mucosal barriers, and causing pain. How do you treat this? One of the common factors to treat this is you repair the mucosal barrier, that is, you give some drugs which will repair the mucosal barrier, or the other reason would other line of treatment would be you try to block this pump. Give a H2 blocker drug or a proton pump blocker, as a result of which, when you give these proton pump blocker drugs, H2 blocker drugs, this blocker drugs, proton pump blocker drugs, this is known as PPI, proton pump inhibitors. When these proton pump inhibitors are taken in, they will block this proton pump. When there is a blockage of this proton pump, hydrogen ions will not be secreted into the lumen. When they are not secreted into the lumen, there is no pain. So this is one of the pharmacological basis for treating conditions of gastric ulcers. Now, what is the rate of ionic composition? What is the secretory rate of the gastric juice? If you see that the gastric juice secretion is maximum whenever you have some food. After an intake of meal, there is high secretion rate which has got a high hydrochloric acid in it. In between the meals, where you call it as the interdigestive period, in that interdigestive period, you will find that the gastric juice is secreted in a very less quantity, but that gastric juice composition contains high quantities of sodium chloride. The pathophysiological basis is, if this interdigestive gastric secretion, that is the gastric juice which is secreted when there is no food in the stomach, or the gastric juice which is secreted in between the meal time, contains high hydrochloric acid, this will result in gastric ulcers or gastritis. This is one of the pathophysiological bases for patients complaining of pain in the epigastrium in between. A high hydrogen ion content in the interdigestive gastric secretions will cause gastric ulcers or predispose to gastric ulcers. And why is there a high hydrogen ion content in the interdigestive gastric secretions? Because of anxiety, stress, and emotional stimuli. Whenever a person is under high anxiety states or is under high stress, there is an increased interdigestive gastric secretions, and this interdigestive gastric secretions contain high quantities of hydrogen ions instead of having high quantity of sodium chloride. Next, what are the functions of the gastric acid? There are three major functions. It is bacteriostatic to extent it because of the acid pH. It helps in destroying the bacteria. It also converts pepsinogen into pepsin, that is the enzyme pepsinogen, inactive enzyme is converted into active enzyme. Once there is an active enzyme formed, it results in protein digestion. What is pepsinogen? Pepsinogen is an inactive secreted form of pepsin. Acid converts pepsinogen to pepsin. This pepsin then is a proteolytic enzyme. It has an optimal function, or its function is maximally seen when the pH is maintained between 1.8 to 3.5. It becomes inactivated when the pH of the stomach goes above 5, and totally inactivated when the pH of the stomach is between 7 to 8. In other words, if there has to be a digestion of proteins, pepsinogen has to be broken down to pepsin, and for this breaking down, acid pH is essential. What causes pepsinogen secretions? Two signals stimulate the secretion of pepsinogen. One is vagal stimulation and the other is direct response to gastric acid. In other words, it is gastric food. So presence of food in the stomach will secrete the pepsinogen. Secondly, vagal stimulation will cause the release of a neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will act on the parietal cells and the chief cells to secrete the pepsinogen and the gastrin hormone. Intrinsic factor in the stomach, as we eat food, dietary protein B12 with dietary vitamin B12 enters. This vitamin B12 has to be bounded by vitamin 2 B12 binding protein, which is present in the gastric juice. In the duodenum, the pancreatic proteases digest the binding protein, releasing the vitamin B12, and in the ileum, it is that intrinsic factor vitamin B12 complex is absorbed. Renin, this renin basically its function is to cause curdling of the milk, causes milk to curdle in the stomach. Milk really retained in the stomach and release more and more slowly. Ultimately, it is broken down because of the action of renin. In the pylorus, you have got two types of gland, the pyloric gland. You have got two types of cells. One is the G cells, which releases the gastrin, and the other is the mucous neck cells, which secrete to a majority of the extent mucin and a very small amount of pepsinogen. Basically, the function of the mucus here is to secrete mucin. Mucin is protective in nature. Now let us briefly see what are the factors which are regulating the gastric secretions. So what are the factors which causes an increase in the gastric secretions, and what are the factors which inhibit the gastric secretions? Basically, the gastric secretions in the stomach is stimulated by neural mechanism, that is nervous reflexes, paracrine and endocrine mechanism. Endocrine mechanism means that there are certain hormones responsible. A hormone is a substance which is secreted at a distant place and acts on an organ which is far away from its place of secretion. Paracrine secretions are those secretions where it is secreted just near the organ, which is secreted at a place, and the hormone so secreted acts on a target organ or a gland nearby. So first of all, neural stimulation, as we know that whenever there is a food in the stomach, this stomach expands or distends. So this distension of the stomach per se causes the secretion of gastric secretion, gastric juice. Plus, it also stimulates the myantric plexus, and in this myantric plexus, specifically the parasympathetic nerves are stimulated. When the parasympathetic nerves are stimulated, it is the vagus nerve which is getting stimulated. The vagus secretes a neurotransmitter acetylcholine. The acetylcholine will act on the cells to secrete hydrochloric acid secretions. It will also cause release of gastrin, pepsinogen, and mucin. So in other words, if you see here, acetylcholine is stimulating the release of the HCl from the chief cells, parietal cells. Also, it is causing the release of certain enzymes like mucin, pepsinogen, and also acting on the G cells to release gastrin hormone. There is another structure which is responsible for the secretion of hydrochloric acid is histamine. It's a very important thing here where the histamine is secreted by the enterochromaffin cells, which is also known as the ECL cells. These ECL cells will secrete histamine. This histamine, once secreted, will go on to the G cells, and there it will stimulate the G cells to cause the hydrochloric acid secretion. In other words, histamine stimulates G cells, that is the gastric cells. The gastric cells will cause increase in the HCl secretion and will maintain a acid pH. Now here again, to control the acidity, we give histamine blockers, which are known as H2 blockers. So suppose a patient is there who is suffering with a gastric ulcer or pain epigastrium after taking food or gastritis, you can prescribe histamine blocking drugs. The mechanism is like this. Histamine secretion after taking food from the ECL cells will stimulate the G cells. G cells will cause HCl secretion, which will increase the acid pH to 2. You give a drug which blocks the action of HCl, which blocks the action of histamine. So histamine is not secreted. When histamine is not secreted, the G cells are not stimulated. When the G cells are not stimulated, hydrochloric acid secretion is curtailed. In this way, the gastric ulcers or gastritis can be cured. The other main hormone which is secreted which helps in the regulation of gastric secretion is gastrin. The gastrin is directly causing, that is the G secreted by the G cells. The G cells will release the hormone gastrin. The gastrin will act on the parietal cells, will cause the release of HCl. This gastrin, the effect of gastrin, when you compare the effect of gastrin and the histamine on the cells to secrete HCl, it is seen that gastrin is a more powerful stimulator than histamine. What is the role of the vagus? How do you explain the role of the vagus in the gastric secretion? Here it is the myantric vagus nerve. Vagus nerve stimulation stimulates the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system will release acetylcholine. It will stimulate the gastric glands in the stomach to secrete HCl secretion. Whereas here in the pyloric end, the enteric nervous system stimulates the pyrotic glands to cause gastrin secretion. This gastrin will again act and cause increased HCl secretion. Now, what are the factors which are regulating the gastric secretion? One is the vagus nerve. Gastrin secretion is stimulated by the stimulation of the vagus nerve. It is not blocked by atropine. Gastrin releasing peptide is a small peptide which is released, also causes the gastrin release from the G cells. Somatostatin is another hormone which is released from the GI tract, and it inhibits the gastrin secretions from the G cells. Any pH which is more than 3 will inhibit the gastrin secretion. Small peptides and amino acids are also likely to stimulate the gastrin release from the G cells. So here it is a diagrammatic representation of the release of the gastrin. Here you will find that there is a vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is releasing acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is stimulating the gastrin cell through the gastric releasing peptides. The stimulation of the gastrin cells will cause release of gastrin. This gastrin will act on the cells to release more of hydrogen ions through the hydrogen potassium proton pump. In addition to this, the other substances which stimulate the gastrin cells is the peptides and the amino acids. So partially digested proteins, that is peptides or amino acids, will again stimulate the gastrin cells. The G cells will stimulate the release of gastrin. The gastrin will act on the hydrogen proton pump cells there, and it will cause the release of hydrogen ions, and an acidic pH is maintained. On the other hand, there is a somatostatin cell. The acetylcholine will inhibit the somatostatin cell. The somatostatin will cause the release of somatotropin. This somatotropin will inhibit the gastrin cells. Now, how do you release? As I said earlier, the regulation of histamine secretion. Histamine is secreted by the enterochromaffin-like cells. They are specialized endocrine cells in the gastric mucosa, and these are releasing histamine. The histamine will now act on the G cells to cause increased release of gastrin. Sometimes in tumors you will find that there is gastrinomas and increased histamine secretions. So now what is the multiplicative effect? We have got so many structures. One is gastrin, which is causing release of hydrogen ions, acetylcholine, histamine. All are individually can release hydrogen ions, can stimulate the parietal cells to secrete hydrogen ions. But when all of them three are acting together, the effect is multiplied. So it is a multiplicative effect on making the stomach pH acidic. Here you see the receptors here. This is the cell which is present there. Hydrogen potassium pump is here. This is the acetylcholine vagus. This is the histamine. This is the gastrin. All three of them can stimulate, when simultaneously stimulated, will cause the formation of hydrogen ion, and this hydrogen potassium pump can release hydrogen ions into the stomach. Acetylcholine cannot be blocked by atropine. Histamine can be blocked by H2 blockers. This gastrin, there is no blocker. So how do you treat a patient with a gastric ulcers or gastritis? Here, either you block this drug, block this site, that is histamine blocker drugs, antihistaminic drugs. When you give this antihistaminic drugs like cimetidine, ranitidine, famotidine, instead of histamine coming and sitting over here, the drug comes and blocks this channel, so that once this channel is blocked, there is no stimulation of the cell to release hydrogen ions. If this fails and if this is not working, the other is you block this proton pump here. When you block this proton pump, there is no movement of hydrogen ions from the cells into the lumen. Now, what are the phases of the acid secretion? Basically, the whole of the gastric secretion is in three phases: cephalic phase, gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. Cephalic phase is 30% of the total gastric secretion. Let's say around 2.5 liters of gastric juice is secreted per day. Out of this 2.5 liters of gastric juice which is secreted, 30% happens during the cephalic phase. The maximum 60% happens during the gastric phase, and 10% happens in the intestinal phase. What do you mean by cephalic phase, gastric phase, and intestinal phase? Cephalic phase means when the food is in the stomach, when the food is in the oral cavity, the gastric juice is released, or the sight of the food, the thought of the food, the smell of the food itself will cause the stomach to secrete the gastric juice. This phase is called as the cephalic phase. The gastric phase of gastric juice secretion is in fact that phase when the gastric juice is secreted when the food is itself in the stomach, and that is around 60%. Intestinal phase is when the food or the chyme has entered from the stomach into the intestines, that is in the duodenum or in the upper part of the small intestine. A small quantities of gastric juice are continued to be secreted in the stomach, and that is the intestinal phase. One more phase is a very small quantity, which is the interdigestive phase, that is the amount of gastric juice which is secreted in between the meals. So here the diagram is showing cephalic phase. How is it happening? A sight of the food, the smell of the food, the taste of the food, or when the food is in the oral cavity itself will cause the stomach to secrete gastric juice. This is known as the cephalic phase. The action is via the vagus nerves. The second phase is the gastric phase. The gastric phase means when the food is in fact in the stomach and the entering from the esophagus into the stomach, the gastric phase secretion of the gastric juice takes place. What is the mechanism of this action? The mechanism of action here is the local nervous reflexes here, that is the distension of the stomach. When you begin to eat food, the stomach gets bloated up or gets distended or starts getting expanded. This stretches the smooth muscle wall. Stretching of the smooth muscle wall will stimulate the myenteric plexus and the local secretory reflexes. So these nerves will cause the cells of the gastric glands to release gastric juice. The other is the vagal nerve, which is the centrally mediated, and third is the gastrin or histamine stimulation, which happens where the food is present in the stomach. The G cells are secreted, the ECL cells are stimulated, and they cause the release of the hormone gastrin and histamine, and they stimulate the gastric juice secretions. Third is the intestinal phase. The intestinal phase is when the food is digested and comes out from the stomach, moves into the small intestine, 10% of the food is secreted, 10% of the gastric juice is secreted during the intestinal phase. The mechanism is the nervous mechanism and the hormonal mechanism. The nervous mechanism is some of the amount when food is entering from the stomach into the intestine, sometimes a stimulatory effect, reverse stimulatory effect occurs, and there is an increased secretion of gastric juice during that time, and certain hormones are released which are known as the paracrine secretions, the gastrointestinal hormones, which will stimulate the gastric glands to secrete gastric juice to a small extent. Again, this is the diagrammatic representation of what we had discussed. The cephalic phase means the sight of the food, the smell of the food, the thought of the food is perceived in the brain. The brains tell the stomach to prepare the food or secrete the gastric juice in anticipation of food coming into the stomach. This is around 30%. The stimuli are the mechanoreceptors and the chemoreceptors. The gastric phase is the phase when in fact the meal enters into the stomach. Several additional factors come into the play, and another 60% of the gastric juice secretion happens in this gastric phase. That is, one, the pH factors can cause the secretion of the gastric juice. There is a distension of the stomach, and there are partially digested proteins and peptides. To an extent, caffeine, coffee, and wine, alcohol also stimulates the gastric juice. That is why they say that after taking a bit of alcohol, there is an increased desire to eat food, hunger is increased. What is the mechanism here? Here there is an increased pH because of gastrin release, distension causes gastric release, acetylcholine stimulates hydrochloric acid secretion. Intestinal phase, distension of the small intestine. In the intestinal phase, we mean that food is entering from the stomach into the intestine. When food enters from the stomach to the intestine, there is a distension of the small intestine. This distension of the small intestine releases certain hormones which are paracrine in nature and causes the gastric gland to secrete. What is the acid response to a meal? Duration of the gastric response to a meal is intragastric pH, on how much is the pH of the stomach and the nature of the chyme which is entering into the duodenum. Before the meal, the pH is low. That means there is a acid secretion is suppressed. That is, when you are not taking food or just before food, the acid secretion is minimal. The pH is more of the basic. Whenever there is a food entering the stomach, the pH becomes more acidic because of the release of hydrogen ions, and that response is to the quality of the meal which you take. In a meal, early meal and a late meal. In a early part of the meal, the acid secretion increases because, that is, suppose if you are eating for around 20 minutes, during the first half of the 10 to 20 minutes, you will find that there is a acid secretion. This gastric secretion in the early part is more of hydrogen ions in nature. That is, there is a high concentration of hydrogen ions in the gastric juice. Because the cephalic phase has already stimulated it, the gastric pH rises. Because of the inhibition of the somatostatin effect is lost, and the presence of proteins or partially digested proteins will cause a hydrogen ion. In a late meal, acid secretions decreases because the pH is already maintained at 8 or 2.8 to 2, and there is a pepsinogen which has got converted into pepsin. So in the later half of the meal, you will find that there is more amount of enzymatic secretion and less amount of acid secretion. What is the gastric mucosal barrier? This gastric mucosal barrier is a physiological and anatomical basis to prevent the leak of hydrogen ions into the stomach wall. Anatomically, it is maintained by tight cell junctions between the cells and between the cell membranes which are lining the stomach wall. Physiologically, diffused hydrogen ions are transported back to the lumen. What are the structures which are maintaining the integrity of the mucosal barrier? It is very important that this mucosal barrier remains intact. If there is any rent or a hole or a break in the mucosal barrier, there will be a high probability that the hydrogen ions will move from the lumen into the stomach wall and will start damaging the stomach wall itself. So what weakens the stomach wall or what weakens this mucosal barrier is the Helicobacter pylori, which is a bacteria, and it is implicated in the most of the gastric ulcers. Drugs like aspirin, NSAIDs, or all your painkillers will weaken the mucosal barrier. That is why it is said that avoid taking painkillers arbitrarily without a prescription, or only when it is needed you have to take this painkiller. And of late the rule is that along with a painkiller, it is necessary that you should take a antacid. Alcohol, ethanol means alcohol. Excess intake of alcohol will also damage the mucosal barrier. Once this damaged mucosal barrier is there, it results in gastritis or ulcers. What strengthens the mucosal barrier is the presence of mucin, a rich high bicarbonate ion levels, increased prostaglandins, and increased secretion of epidermal growth factor. If all these are in high quantities, it's formed and secreted in high quantities, there is a healthy mucosal barrier and no ulcers. Thank you. With that, we will stop here. In the next class, we shall talk about certain factors which are causing gastric motility, which controls the movement of the stomach, factors which are proactive or which are promoting the stomach contractions, and we should also see what are the factors which are inhibiting this contraction. Thank you one and all. Have a good day. I have some.